Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today's video I wanted to talk more about the very strong possibility that games will take much longer to develop for Nintendo Switch 2 than we've ever seen before. And of course, with a massive increase in power and performance, like a generational leap in technology, the time it takes to develop games for the new and more advanced technology will of course increase. This has happened basically every generation, with each new generation bringing higher development costs and longer development time for games. So with that being said, will Nintendo Switch 2 games take longer to make? Well, before I get into it, I do want to make a quick, big thanks once again to over 500 subscribers at this point. It's crazy, guys. I want to thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. It means the world to me. So I just want to say a quick thanks. I know I've said this in previous videos that I don't want to keep doing this every video because it may get annoying. I did have a viewer of mine suggest that I start using the community tab on the channel for situations like this, but I felt like specifically for this situation with reaching the 500 milestone, I thought I'd make an exception. So once again, I will give a big thanks. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So let's just jump right into the topic at hand. So the question posed at the beginning of this video: will Nintendo Switch 2 games take longer to make? The short answer is yes. I do feel they will take much longer to make. So if that's all you wanted to hear, then feel free to click off the video now. I guess you got your answer, but feel free to stick around if you wanted to hear a little bit more about why I feel this way. So yes, I do believe that Nintendo Switch 2 games will take longer to make, but why exactly? Why will Nintendo Switch 2 games take longer to make than previous generations of Nintendo, like Nintendo Switch or Wii U or Wii? Well, the answer is fairly simple, and I'm going to start with talking about the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series, because I feel like these are the best modern examples of the situation regarding game development nowadays and how long it's taking for big franchises to have new entries. And again, Elder Scrolls 6 comes to mind. There are other entries, of course, like Last of Us that we'll get into, that also take much longer to make nowadays. So the PS5 and Xbox Series, they launched in 2020, and more than 3 years in, we still haven't really felt the impact of this new generation of games. In other words, games that take full advantage of the new hardware. We just haven't seen as big an impact in this regard as we have in previous generations. And we'll talk about previous generations, such as the 7th generation in particular, that I have really fond memories of, not just because of nostalgia, but also because simply the output of games during that generation, it was crazy. So we'll get into that pretty soon. But we're talking about games this generation, and we're talking about the lack of impact that these games are having. In other words, they're not taking full advantage of this new hardware of the PS5 and Xbox Series X. It's also taking much longer for these games to come out. Starfield and The Elder Scrolls 6 are good examples of this. Starfield took quite a while to develop, and it finally did launch last year, but it still took significantly longer to make a game like this than it would have to make a game like The Elder Scrolls 5 Skyrim or Oblivion. At this point on, more than 3 years into the launch of this next generation fleet of consoles, we still have yet to see big boundary pushing entries in existing franchises, or even just in general brand new IP. We've gotten some here and there, but to say that there's been a massive impact, such as what happened during previous generations, would be too much. A lot of games that come out nowadays tend to be remakes or remasters, specifically when it comes to Nintendo this year, although again that's a pretty big exception considering that I do genuinely believe that the next generation of Nintendo is launching this year, so I kind of understand from that perspective. But in terms of the other consoles that are on the market, we're seeing games like Final Fantasy VII Remake, and even the Dead Space remake. The Dead Space remake, by the way, is absolutely fantastic. This is not me saying that the game isn't. It definitely is. It is a great remake, and probably one of the best I've played. It's fantastic. However, nonetheless, it is a remake of a game that already exists rather than being a brand new IP. And keep in mind, Dead Space at one point was in fact a brand new IP during, guess which generation? The 7th generation. But before we get to that, even the 8th generation of consoles, such as the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, suffered from a lagging output of games, a slower output of games. Like, Let's consider The Last of Us Part 2, right? The Last of Us Part 2, of course, came out and received a mixed response overall from gamers, although it was critically acclaimed. From gamers, it was a little bit more mixed, but nonetheless, that game took a significantly long time to develop. There was a lot of time and effort that was put into it over the course of several years. By the time it came out, the PS4 was reaching the tail end of its lifespan. In fact, that was the first generation where I truly felt like games just took forever to make. Though, as someone who enjoys making small indie games on the side, I definitely understand that game development does take a significant amount of time and effort, regardless of the technology you're using. Let's look at some past examples in past generations of gaming that gives us a good idea and basically a glimpse of what we can expect from this generation and even future generations for gaming. So let's talk about the 7th generation, something that I've been bringing up many times in this video already. 2007, for example, hosted a number of high-quality releases from various developers, not just Nintendo, but basically everyone. We have Super Mario Galaxy, we have Halo 3, and even new IPs such as BioShock and Uncharted were introduced during this generation. And that was just in 2007 alone. If we're talking about this generation of gaming, we were introduced to the likes of Assassin's Creed, of The Witcher. It was crazy. A crazy amount of amazing entries in existing franchises, but as well as in brand new IPs built from the ground up. And of course, as a Metroid fan, I will also have to bring up that Metroid Prime 3 Corruption was also released in 2007. Fantastic game. But the 7th generation, that really was the last time that I felt as a gamer that games were coming out at a steady pace. It was the perfect pace, and creativity was at an all-time high for basically every studio out there. It's not like the 7th gen was perfect, but as far as game output was concerned, it was peak. And again, I could make an entire video on the 7th generation of gaming alone, or even just the year 2007 alone. It was pretty crazy. But that being said, the 7th generation wasn't exactly immune to games taking long to make. Again, this was a generation ahead of the 6th generation, which had the likes of the GameCube, the PlayStation 2, and the original Xbox. Naturally, this was the first generation where we truly felt like the technology was there to make bigger, better, and bolder games, and we saw that with the likes of Oblivion, like I mentioned before, Skyrim. We had the Fallout series. We had The Witcher come out. These are big games, and even from Nintendo themselves, we saw them do much more ambitious things with Mario Galaxy and Zelda Twilight Princess. This was a generation that, despite the fact that it still took longer to make games, companies still managed to produce games at a steady pace. We can't say the same for nowadays, really, but again, this is not me blaming developers necessarily, because again, I understand that with an increase in power and performance, a generational leap, for example, it will take more time. It's inevitable and it's understandable. We're all human beings. Developers are human beings, and we can't just magically make a game with a snap of our fingers and then there you go, release it. No, it takes much longer and much more effort than that. Now, moving away from that, I do want to point out that despite the fact that I think that other developers and other companies have been suffering a lot from a slower pace of game output, I want to stress that Nintendo is not immune to this. Nintendo, like all others, has also suffered from this. This has already happened before, in fact. Remember the jump from the Wii to the Wii U during the 8th generation? The Wii U sat dry for most of its life due to its sales performance, but even before it was deemed a failure, Nintendo was already taking much longer to release big games for the platform. This is where we started to see a slowing down of big entries in Nintendo's established IPs like Zelda and Mario. And I'm sure every Zelda fan out there has already been taking note that basically each gap between mainline releases have been increasing steadily over the last few entries. For example, we see that the gap from Wind Waker to Twilight Princess was about 3 years. Not too bad, right? But then from Twilight Princess to Skyward Sword, it was the whopping 5 years. And then of course from Skyward Sword to Breath of the Wild, it was 6 years. And then from Breath of the Wild to Tears of the Kingdom, it was another 6 years, maybe slightly longer. So we're seeing that the gaps between entries are in fact increasing. And keep in mind that Tears of the Kingdom is an iterative sequel, meaning that it takes a lot of the same elements and the same models and assets, many of the things from Breath of the Wild, that when you think about it, the fact that it still took around 6 years to develop it and then for it to come out is crazy. So despite being an iterative sequel, it still took just as long to develop Breath of the Wild. And keep in mind, Breath of the Wild was developed from the ground up. Even when we look at Mario games, the gap is getting wider and wider. From 3D World to Odyssey, it took roughly 4 years. Not too bad. But then from Odyssey to the next 3D Mario game, whenever that's going to be, we have no idea what to expect or when to expect the next 3D Mario game at this point. It's been roughly almost 7 years since Odyssey came out, since the first year of the Switch's life. It's been quite a while. That being said, do I think that it's always going to take 7 years between 3D Mario game releases? No. I think if we're going by the timeline of 3D Mario games, I think that there's a little bit more variability in this regard. Compared to Zelda games, I think Mario games tend to be a little bit more all over the place when it comes to the gaps, when it comes to the length of each gap between each entry. So just because the next 3D Mario game is going to take roughly 7 years or more at this point for it to come out, I don't necessarily think that that's going to be the case for every Mario game moving forward. I just think it's something worth considering that I do believe that the next Mario game will be a Switch 2, or whatever the next system will be called. I do think it will be an exclusive for that system. I think it's being developed specifically for that hardware, and I think that that is a partial reason why it is taking much longer. So with all that being said, I do believe that overall, Nintendo Switch 2 games specifically made by Nintendo are going to take much longer to make. If we go by the ever-increasing gap between entries for Zelda games, and even 7 years waiting for the next Mario game, and other little hints here and there, such as the fact that even from other developers, games just take longer to make nowadays given the new technology, I do think it will inevitably take longer for games to come out on average nowadays. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's something that we can look forward to. There's still games that we can look forward to, and it only means that maybe, just maybe, games will be bigger and better than they've ever been, especially coming from Nintendo. I, for one, am looking forward to seeing the next generation of Nintendo games, how they're going to look, how they're going to play, how big in scope they may end up being. I think it's going to be a great time. I think the next generation of Nintendo is going to bring about some great, great games. So with that being said, guys, I just want to thank you for watching this video. Thank you for your support, and I will see you on the next one. Have a good one. Take care. Bye-bye.